China has made it pretty clear to Putin, in a sense, what you've done in Ukraine has got us dictators a bad enough name. Don't even think of going nuclear.
And this morning, indeed, Russia has ejected 6 British diplomats. Let's discuss all this with Lord Dannatt, former head of the British Army. Welcome to the show, Lord Dannatt.
Thanks, Ed. Good morning.
The obvious question, which everyone is thinking, which is about escalation. I don't think anyone, well, I can't put words into people's mouths, but people wouldn't necessarily object to using missiles to attack Russia, but they're very worried about what Russia's response will be. How do we evaluate that?
Well, I think it's right that we are concerned about whatever Russia's retaliation would be, but I think that needs to be weighed up and put to one side to a fair degree. I think the whole underlying issue is that we have been prepared to give various grades of weapons to the Ukrainians, but then putting restrictions on the use of those weapons effectively ties one hand behind their back, as many people have been observing. And I think for the Ukrainians to be successful on the battlefield, either to be successful in the remote possibility that they might be able to defeat the Russian army, or more likely that they can gain a better position of advantage on the battlefield if it comes to future negotiations. The Ukrainians have got to be able to conduct what we would call the deep, close and rear battle. And to fight successfully the deep battle, they've got to be able to use the long-range weapons that we've given them. And that's to use those weapons in a sensible and focused way on legitimate military targets in Russia. It's from those various air bases that Russian aircraft have taken off and launched their missiles and their glide bombs on pretty indiscriminate targets within Ukraine. So it's entirely legitimate that, having given them Storm Shadow and ATACMS and other long-range systems, that we allow the Ukrainians to use them within the rules of war to enable them to more successfully prosecute the deep aspect of the overall battle, which is a combination of deep, close and rear operations.
And what do we do when Putin talks about using nuclear weapons, as he has done in the past? There are protocols in place. Even a battlefield nuclear weapon would be regarded as obviously, well, it makes it sound like I think a battlefield nuclear weapon is tolerable. How does the West respond if he uses a battlefield nuclear weapon? Is that even likely?
Well, I think there are two main points about the nuclear threat from Vladimir Putin. One is a practical one. The Soviet and our Russian military doctrine talks about using tactical nuclear weapons in circumstances such as when the enemy has broken through and you want to stem a local advance. Now, if the Ukrainians were able to do that, perhaps in the way that they have in Kursk province recently, then under Russian military doctrine, you could say that would then be a target for a tactical nuclear weapon. But just stop and think what the effect of that would be. If they were to use it in Kursk, or they were to use it in one of the Donbass provinces, they would be obliterating for decades to come, say 25 square miles of Russian territory, or in the Donbass provinces, what they've declared as to be forever Russia. So why would Putin actually want to do that? And I think the second point is that President Xi of China has made it pretty clear to Putin, in a sense, what you've done in Ukraine has got us dictators a bad enough name. Don't even think of going nuclear. So they'll huff and puff and they'll bluster and they'll threaten about nuclear weapons. But practically, and I think in principle, I think it's most unlikely, and a lot of people would agree, that they will use them. Yes, okay, if Putin decides he wants to escalate in other ways, well, we'll have to react to that. That might be attacks on communications under the sea, pipelines, cables. It might be cyber attacks. Well, those are risks that have got to be weighed up and they've got to be confronted and dealt with at the time. But the underlying point is, having given them these weapons, we should not impose restrictions on how they use them in order to give the Ukrainians the best chance of prevailing on the battlefield.
Brilliant. Well, that's Lord Dannatt, former head of the British Army, talking about the imminent decision, we understand, that the Ukrainians may be allowed to use British-made weapons on Russian territory and what that could mean in terms of the potential escalation of the conflict in Ukraine. The UK has obviously said that the Kremlin claims that 6 diplomats who've been expelled from Russia were spies is completely baseless. The expulsions come as Sir Keir Starmer travels to the US to meet President Joe Biden, where the pair are expected to discuss allowing Ukraine to use British and American long-range missiles to attack Russia. Vladimir Putin has warned that if NATO countries do provide more help to Ukraine, Russia will effectively be at war with them. I'm joined now by the Times columnist and the Russian expert, Edward Lucas. Welcome to the show.
Hello.
Thank you for coming on. We've been debating this all show. I mean, how seriously should we take the Russia threat if we start to allow Ukraine to use weapons on Russian territory?
I think we should take very seriously the fact that Putin is nuclear saber-rattling, as he has been since the beginning of this conflict, and indeed before. But that doesn't mean that we should actually take the threats seriously. We heard exactly the same rhetoric when it was about tanks. We ended up sending tanks, air defences. We sent air defences, the F-16. Some countries have sent F-16s. So this is the Kremlin playbook. This isn't just a war on the ground in Ukraine and in the bit of Russia that they've liberated. This is a war of nerves in London, Brussels, Paris, Berlin, and most of all Washington, D.C. And to some extent, the war of nerves has worked better than the war on the ground. The war on the ground has been really quite a bad failure from a Russian point of view, but the war of nerves has been quite successful because they've prevented at least some Western decision makers giving Ukraine the weapons that Ukraine needs to win the war and bring it to a speedy end.
And what do you think? The timing of these expulsions are obviously designed to coincide with Starmer going to the US, aren't they?
Well, actually, I think my sources on the ground tell me that the expulsions actually happened several weeks ago, and some of I don't think any of those 6 are actually left in Russia now. I've been having a look at them on looking them up on the internet. One of them seems to have arrived in Russia only a couple of months. He only joined the Foreign Office a couple of months ago. So his diplomatic career has, I regard this as an enormous promotion, by the way. I was expelled myself from the Soviet Union. It was one of the greatest honours of my life to be told that you're banned for life in the Soviet Union. You can never come back. So it's actually a great way to to show your mettle as a diplomat. I don't.
Were you a journalist or a diplomat when you were expelled, Edward?
I was a journalist. I got into the Soviet Union. I got into Lithuania with Lithuanian visa 0001 back in 1990, at a time when Lithuania was still occupied. And I thought it was an absolute hoot, but the KGB didn't see the funny side of it.
Can you tell us what happened? Do they give you an interview without coffee? What do? They take you into a windowless room and a bare table and say, Mr. Lucas, I mean, was it scary in any way?
Well, I was much younger at the time, and so I thought it was tremendously exciting. And I had succeeded in getting into Lithuania under the noses of the Soviets, and sort of to some extent broken the taboo and showed that Lithuania was a success. What was on the way to restoring its independence. But yeah, I was given quite a grilling. They couldn't quite work out. I was actually in the KGB headquarters in Grodno, in neighbouring Belarus, trying to leave. I actually walked in and said, I want to leave. And they thought I was a smuggler, and they kept on saying, how many cigarettes did you bring with you? And in the end, they were pretty sort of unfriendly. But the key thing was they said, we're putting you on the next train to Poland. You must get out at the first stop. Under no circumstances you to go any further. And I was put in the charge of an old crone who was sort of there to make that happen. But of course, she couldn't survey the whole train. So I got off her compartment, walked down the train, got into the compartment at the end and went all the way to West Berlin, where I greeted her when I got there. And her face was something to behold.
Very quickly, just on the point about the expulsion, of course, we forget that there is a sort of unwritten rule, isn't there? Because the Russians obviously have hundreds of diplomats here in London, for example. So they can't just gratuitously keep expelling our diplomats without expecting reprisals. How likely is it that the Brits will expel 6 Russian diplomats next week?
I don't think they have hundreds now. I mean, it's a pretty, both the embassy and the so-called trade mission and the so-called military attaché's office, which are all nests of spies, are thinly staffed, because we've chucked out quite a lot of people after Salisbury and in response to other things. So I think that there will be expulsions. The difficulty is that if you chuck out the plumber at the Russian embassy, he's probably actually a colonel in the Russian intelligence, whereas you chuck out the support staff at our embassy, they are actually probably doing the sort of support stuff. So in a way, these hit us harder than they hit the Russians. But that's the world we're in. I suspect the ambassador in Moscow will be making their own coffee now, and perhaps maybe having to hoover the office, and with perhaps a very small number of staff accompanying.
Excellent. Well, Edward Lucas, thank you so much for coming on the show. Edward Lucas, a Times columnist and a Russian expert, and a man who's been expelled from the Soviet Union, to talk about the diplomatic expulsions undertaken by the Russian government.